Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. Breaking news out of California as frontrunner Democratic candidate Eric Swalwell drops out of the race for governor as he has been inundated with sexual assault allegations over the past week. Now, what does this mean for California and what does it mean for his seat in Congress? Plus, we've got some very important updates on court rulings that we've discussed over the past few weeks as the highest court in the land weighs in on some issues directly affecting California. All of that and more on today's show. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. Our first order of business for today is we have to talk about what is going on with Eric Swalwell. Now, as you'll recall, just 2 weeks ago, I did an episode talking about the 5 worst candidates for governor in our race here in California. And number 1 in that episode was Eric Swalwell. Now, what I didn't know 2 weeks ago was that so much was going to unfold that would end up booting him out of the race entirely. And so I didn't plan on talking about the governor's race for another few weeks, at least, just spacing it out, covering different topics. But there's so much that has unfolded over just the past 7 days that I thought that it was very important for all of us to be updated on, and especially just to keep up to date with everything happening so I don't come back in a month and be like, the entire landscape has shifted. So we need to dive in. What exactly has happened? Well, if you haven't been following the news, here is your rundown. Just a week ago, allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse started coming out from multiple women against Eric Swalwell. And so it kind of started as one allegation and then it snowballed as others spoke up. It started to hit the media. And so obviously right away, Swalwell had to put out a video that said that he did not do this, that this was not true, and he denied all of the allegations. Let's watch a clip of that.
These allegations of sexual assault are flat false. They're absolutely false. They did not happen. They have never happened. And I will fight them with everything that I have. I do not suggest to you in any way that I'm perfect or that I'm a saint. I have certainly made mistakes in judgment in my past. But those mistakes are between me and my wife. And to her, I apologize deeply for putting her in this position.
So we see there that he seems like he's trying to be genuine, that he's saying they are flat false, that he has done nothing wrong. But unfortunately, more and more evidence has continued to come out. There's been a pretty damning video that's come out of some of these allegations. And so even as he has denied them, he completely lost support. And just a quick note of irony here, Eric Swalwell was a really vocal proponent of the Me Too movement a few years ago. He's been a really big proponent of Believe All Women. And so it's just really hard to get on video and say, these are not true, believe me, when previously you would have said, we believe all women, everything that they say, regardless of the evidence that's being presented. And so he's kind of now being held to his own standards. If people are coming out with allegations, and then especially if those allegations have evidence, then of course people are going to start to turn on him. And so what we've seen is that everyone from both the left and the right have been calling on this guy to drop out of the governor's race. And then it's even snowballed from there into calling on him to resign from Congress. And so we've seen that all 21 Democrats who supported his campaign, who endorsed him to be governor of California, completely dropped him. That includes people like Nancy Pelosi. That includes Minority House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries. And so everyone's been turning on this guy. And then additionally, 50 of his staffers have also called on him to resign as well as to quit the race. And so that just is not a good look. On Sunday of this week, he suspended his campaign for governor. And then on Monday, he officially announced his resignation from Congress. Now, I just want to speak for a second to the nature of the mob, because what we saw here was a very swift, very quick ouster of Swalwell, not only from the race, but also from his job in Congress, where he has served for over 13 years. And so I think it's important that we address a few things that come up whenever there are allegations of misconduct, like have been leveraged against Swalwell. And so I think something that we first need to address is that there are definitely mixed motives at play. Now, are some people denouncing him because they genuinely believe all of the allegations, because they have knowledge and insight into the situation, and they are genuinely outraged and disgusted at Swalwell's behavior? I'm sure that those people exist. But we would be remiss if we didn't also mention the fact that there are people who will call on him to drop out or to resign because they don't align with him politically. And so, of course, Republicans or conservatives would see an opportunity to get him out of Congress or to have him drop out of the race. And they already don't like his politics. And so then this is convenient for them. And then additionally, we see people from his own party who it's kind of an open secret that Swalwell has been engaging in these activities, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But people who likely have known for years, or at least have had suspicions of these activities, but who it hasn't really been politically convenient for them to come out and denounce him. And now it's more expedient for them to, instead of defending him against the mob, just join the mob and say, yep, we believe all of these allegations and it's time for him to get out. So there's a lot of motivations at play here, and they're not all pure. But regardless of that, I think that we should be careful, and that we should say that all of these allegations demand a full hearing, a full investigation. Everyone who has made claims against him should have their claims heard. At the same time, any sort of criminal charge that is being alleged here should have a fair trial so that Swalwell can also be able to defend himself against whatever is being claimed. And so I just want to acknowledge that I think with situations like this, it is a hard balance. And it's a hard balance because we live in an extreme world. And on top of that, we don't have all of the information. You don't want to ignore victims. You don't want to say, well, we just don't believe any women. That would be horrendous. At the same time, you don't want to rush to make judgments about things that you have not seen evidence for. And so what I think is very dangerous is the sort of mob mentality that we even saw play out over the last week, where you see a few things come out and all of a sudden there's just a rush of everybody is yelling at this guy to get out of Congress, to leave absolutely everything. I think we should be careful with that. We want to have a consistent standard across the board when allegations are made for how they are going to be fleshed out, how they are going to be examined. And we wouldn't want to rush to have someone resign who the allegations against were not true. And so with that, a swift downfall, like we've seen with Swalwell, may be just. It may be just if the evidence supports it. It also may not be just if there's not evidence to support it. And so when I heard about this, I just wanted to slow down and take a step back and think, if allegations came out against Chad Bianco or against Steve Hilton tomorrow, how would I want that situation handled? Would I want every single conservative across the board to just come out and immediately denounce them, have them kicked out of their current jobs, have them outed from the race, and just assume that all of the allegations are true? Or would I want to see evidence? And obviously, I'd want to see evidence. I would want that presented, and I want them to be able to defend themselves in a fair trial. It's a little bit different with Swalwell because there is evidence. And so, as I said, there's a video that's out that's pretty damning. There is text evidence as well as multiple witnesses, multiple victims coming out against him. And these are not new allegations. Some of them are from years ago that were made at the time. And then we also see Swalwell's history with his contact with Fang Fang, the Chinese spy. So it's definitely not out of character. So that's a key difference. There is evidence. Do I think that Swalwell is just innocent? No, I think there's evidence that shows the opposite of that. And so all of that to say, does the response seem totally unfair? I don't think so. But at the same time, are there likely reasons for people wanting this kind of response against Eric Swalwell that are beyond just moral outrage at the situation? Yes, I think that that's true at the same time. Trying to walk that middle line of justice and fairness in a cancel culture world, again, very hard to do, but I think that we should give the same respect to politicians who we strongly, vehemently disagree with, that we would the politicians who we admire and who we would want to defend as well. And really, this is why policies matter the most. I already came out and said that Swalwell was the worst candidate, and it wasn't because of all of these allegations. It was well before this. I didn't know any of these. And that was was based primarily on his policies, the fact he didn't have any policies, and the fact that all of the main ones that he supported are ideas that have already been in place in California and that have led to a lot of the problems that our state has seen. So I already told you and could tell you that he would be an awful governor, and now this just adds to it. And so you have to be careful when we evaluate candidates. We don't want to make their personality, and we don't even want to make their personal life or their morality the only standard that we look at. If we hold that standard, we might never have someone in power because there's no one who is perfect. At the same time, though, we can't completely downplay character. Character is very important. I think that leaders should have integrity. I think that they should have moral upstanding. And so the mess that we get ourselves into really is trying to make the best decision. Whenever you look at the field of candidates for any type of race, we need to be asking the question of who here would be best politically with the policies that they will pass, as well as best as a leader. And so sometimes we have great candidates. You might have multiple options. And so then it just comes down to little nuances here and there. Sometimes, though, you might be choosing the lesser of two evils. And so you might not have great options. And I could see that happening in California. For those who support President Donald Trump, in the primary, you might have voted for a different candidate, but once it came to the general election and it was President Trump versus Kamala Harris, there wasn't really much of a choice. There's the lesser of the two evils. And so really it boils down to, in any race, we are trying to restrain evil as much as possible. And Eric Swalwell, for many, many reasons, was not going to do that, even without these allegations. Now, obviously, this matters for us because this shakes up the governor's race entirely. Swalwell had amassed between 10 to 13% of recent polling, just depending on which polls and honestly which day. And so that's not really insignificant. In a race that's so fragmented, where there's so many candidates, if a lot of that, like if 10% could shift somewhere else, that's enough to bump someone into first place. Now, if it breaks up, it could just be enough to continue closing the gap between the front runners and maybe people who are in third or fourth place. And so the person who, it's being said, has the most to gain from this could be Katie Porter, especially because she is a woman. And so there's some sensitivity around this issue. People look to her to be able to speak more credibly on accusations like this. And so she could be able to gain a lot of Swalwell's supporters. But at the same time, Porter's not super likable, and she had a lot of scandals last year. And so now it's also coming out that Steyer is rising in the polls. We haven't talked about Steyer extensively on this show. I'm sure that we'll cover him at some point, but his polling has been rising as well. And he specifically had targeted attack ads that were toward Eric Swalwell. So it's kind of ironic that now he's entirely out of the race. But he had originally seen Swalwell as his main competition. And so if that is out of the way, then it seems like he is poised to be able to rise in the polls as well. The biggest question around this entire controversy is that it seems like odd timing. Why all of a sudden are allegations from years ago being brought to light? Why, when Eric Swalwell had an entire controversy around the fact that he was sleeping with a Chinese spy, all of a sudden we care about his moral character? It just seems weird. And people are pointing that out because they are saying that it, again, has been an open secret, especially among journalists, among media, and among government officials that Swalwell has regularly interacted with. And so one journalist went on the record saying, quote, "Shortly after being elected to Congress in 2013, Swalwell's behavior toward women was known by all levels of our local government and the Alameda County Democratic Party. I tried repeatedly to get the stories out. I can't force women to speak out, and when they chose not to, I didn't push. I also knew that Swalwell was known to threaten litigation." And so there are many stories like this of people who knew that he had some misgivings when it comes to how he interacted with his staff, how he was on campaigns, how he was in office. So it's not really a surprise, and I have a hard time believing that all of the main Democrats who supported his campaign for governor didn't know anything about his character flaws. I don't believe that at all. After all, he ran for president in 2019. That is a very high achievement that he was trying to make. He was elected to and has served in Congress for over 13 years. And most recently, 21 of those fellow Democrat members endorsed his campaign. So then the question is, what do they stand to gain? And what they would stand to gain is that the race is super split up among Democrats. Swalwell was not the first to announce. He came in kind of late to the game and has been amassing a lot of those votes. And Democrats have been very nervous because our frontrunners in our race have been two Republicans. So there's been a lot of talk about what happens if Democrats get completely locked out of the November election, which would just be wonderful if that happened. But they are very scared of that. And so there's some speculation there of who leaked this? Why is it coming up now? Why all of a sudden is it coming out just, weeks before the ballots are going to go out, months before the actual election? And so the idea is it wasn't convenient for them in the past to kick him out of Congress, but it's convenient now because it might consolidate support for Democrats. All speculation. And regardless of that, regardless of the timing, Swalwell is clearly not the best option that we had for California governor. I was advising, do not vote for this man. He would make a terrible leader for many reasons beyond his personal failings and all of the things coming out about him. And so I cry no tears at his exit. So stay tuned. Things are going to shift. It's just the nature of elections, of campaigns, of polls. The polls this week are not going to be the same next week as they're going to be in June before we vote in the primary. And so it is very important that we stay up to date on what's happening on the main issues and that we stay resolved in what makes a good leader and who we want to elect here in California. But the Swalwell news is not the only recent news that is affecting our state because, as I talked about a few weeks ago on the show, there have been some higher court rulings that have specifically gone against California's entrenched policies around immigration, around parental rights, and around gun rights. And so recently, there was a Supreme Court ruling on the parental rights aspect of those bills that I want us to stay up to date on. And it's actually really good news. So let's just step back for a second and let's remember the current law that's in place in California. Here we have Assembly Bill 1955. We've talked about this so many times. It was passed in 2024. It's known as the Safety Act. And what it does is it says that school boards across the state of California cannot force teachers to notify parents if children in their class, the children of the parents, make any changes to their name, pronouns, or gender identity. And so what this does is it quote unquote protects children who want to transition at school without telling their parents. And it's framed by proponents, by Governor Newsom, by those who advocate for it, as a sort of protection against forced outing bills. So they view schools that say teachers need to inform parents of these shifts in children's mental health as forced outings of those children. And they say that parents don't have the right necessarily to know that children should be able to make that decision for themselves. And so we are not going to mandate that teachers have to tell that information to parents. But this is a problem because this takes away the parent's ability to know intimate information about their child, important information, because something like their gender identity is a huge expression of where they're at mentally, what their mental health is, where they're at spiritually, what they're thinking, what they're going through emotionally. And so for parents just to be shut out of all of that, to have no idea, to have their student be one person at home and then be an entirely different person at school, completely goes against the idea that the parent is the parent and the teacher is not the parent. And so this bill is problematic for so many reasons. But back in December, there was a court ruling that we talked about where Judge Benitez put an injunction on having to enforce AB 1955. And he did so on the basis of, quote, the rights of parents to direct the medical care and religious upbringing of their children long predate any proclaimed responsibility of the state over children in the United States. And so this was a huge win because advocates who have been pushing against AB 1955 have been saying that this completely destroys parental rights and we need to reclaim those rights in schools. And so this means that AB 1955 could not be enforced in school boards, which means that more conservative counties would be able to pass laws that say that schools are required to tell parents if their children are trying to socially or physically transition from a different gender at school. But here's the problem. As with all things with courts, nothing's ever permanent. Every time you make some kind of ruling, it can just get kicked up and overturned and stayed and whatnot. And so this injunction was immediately put on hold by another court. So there's been a lot of talk about it. Governor Newsom himself was very confident, saying that this would get thrown out, it would be overturned. And so it was unclear. Could the injunction actually be effective? Could it go into effect and mean that schools can deny or ignore AB 1955? Well, the good news is that the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in our country, has weighed in. And so SCOTUS did not take up the entire case, but what it did take up was just the injunction part. So they put out something called as a preliminary ruling. What this means is that they gave a ruling on how they would rule if the case was brought before them. And then they also give an opinion based on that if the injunction can stay in place, because they base it on the likelihood of how they would rule if it came up to them as the Supreme Court. So what they said is that they were likely, a majority of the justices on the Supreme Court were likely to side with the California plaintiffs who were suing the state for these laws and these policies. And what they said is, quote, California's policies substantially interfere with the right of parents to guide the religious development of their children. Furthermore, they also ruled that these policies, quote, cut out the primary protectors of children's best interests, who are their parents, and that parents have long had a primary authority with respect to the upbringing and education of children, including the right to not be shut out of participation in decisions regarding their children's mental health. And so this is huge. This is everything that we've talked about. This is the Supreme Court of the United States recognizing that parents have the fundamental right to raise their children and that parents should not be completely shut out of decisions that affect their mental health, that they should know everything with regard to their child, and that parents should be seen as the primary protectors of their children, not as someone who teachers have to protect children from. Now, even though this isn't a final ruling, so this isn't SCOTUS reviewing the whole case and then giving a final ruling, this signals to the lower courts who are still discussing this issue how they would rule, which has a pretty heavy weight. It's unlikely that lower courts would want to go against the Supreme Court of the United States and then have to continue pushing that case upwards when they've pretty much already said how they would rule. And so this is huge because this lays the legal foundation, the legal precedent for parents who have been affected by AB 1955, parents who were not told about what was going on with their child at school. This allows parents to sue the school boards and likely win based on this kind of precedent. So for anyone who heard about AB 1955, as I did, as we did on this show, and was just outraged and said, this is unacceptable, how is this in place in our state? This is a huge victory because to have the Supreme Court basically handing down a ruling on it and to have that side with parents is so phenomenal for our state. It's such good news for families, for children, for parents in our state. But what in the world could I be saying but about in regards to this issue? But we have to notice something very important because while this is a victory and I'm so happy about it, I do just want to point out there are a few things we need to continue to think through because I don't think that the ruling put out by SCOTUS actually goes far enough to address the core issues at play in our state. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the main argument made by the justices, which I just read portions of it to you, clearly have to do with parental rights. So they talk a lot about religious freedom. They talk a lot about how it is the parents' right to bring up their child under their care in the way that they see fit. And so they say that we cannot impose laws that go against parents' abilities to raise their children in alignment with their values. And that's true. That's wonderful. That should be protected. But on the issue of transitioning, on the issue of transgenderism, that's not the only factor at play. The question when it comes to AB 1955 is not simply a question about parental rights. I would argue it's not even fundamentally a question about parental rights. It is a question about objective truth and biological reality. AB 1955 was passed with the main purpose of trying to protect LGBTQ children from their parents. The inherent underlying assumption is that if the parents do not agree with, if the parents do not affirm their child wanting to socially transition, wanting to medically transition, wanting to change their gender entirely, that is inherently wrong of parents to do and something that teachers must protect students from. And so that would indicate some sort of abuse. And so what the court ruling lacks is that it does not fundamentally define objective truth such that the affirmation of biological reality is not abuse, and that gender affirming care for transitioning is abuse. But the core problem that we run into on this issue is that the two are not the same. A parent who is raising their child and saying the gender that you were born into, the sex that you were born into biologically is who you are, that is not changing, that it is a good thing, that there are beautiful things, there are challenges as well inherent to each gender, but there are beautiful things in both genders. And so I'm going to raise you in accordance biologically with what the reality is. That is not the same morally as a parent who says, no, you can just change your gender, that there's not even just two genders, that there's infinite genders. And so we can change it to be whatever we want. And we will pursue these types of medical procedures to make that happen. The two are not morally equivalent, and we should not treat them as such. And the crazy part is that this shouldn't be boiled down to be a religious issue. The idea of male and female isn't a religious idea. It's a biological one. It's one that you can look in nature and look in reality and look at us as humans and realize is self-evident. And so you don't have to be religious in order to believe that men are men and that women are women and that there are substantial differences. But there's been a shift in the past decades in our society to be uncomfortable with objective truth. And so what has happened over recent years is that often objective truths are protected under the umbrella of religious liberty, but they don't really even belong there because you should be able to see them in society. It really is the true definition of common sense, of common decency, and of reality, of biological fact that's in front of you. And so my point here is that the ruling is incredible and I'm very happy about it. But we cannot pretend that this SCOTUS ruling just answers all questions on the issue, because we have to be people who continue to press on for truth in our society, who have to keep fighting for a society where it is not controversial to say that the gender that you're born in is not changeable. And that's a good thing, that there are many things to be celebrated about that gender that you were born into. And there are many ways to help you to be comfortable with it and to thrive inside of it. You do not have to, and quite frankly, you should not see this issue as just merely a personal choice, merely as a parenting choice that is just neutral and can go either way depending on your deeply held beliefs. Instead, it is a choice against what is fundamentally true, and we could never be in support of that. So, a lot of wild things at play in California politics lately, some good, some bad, but we see a through line, and that is that the truth really does matter. It matters for what leaders we want to elect to represent us and the policies that they are going to put in place. It matters for how we raise and teach children and raise up the next generation. And it absolutely matters for shaping the state, the country, and all of the institutions around you that affect your life. Because when the truth is ignored, then, as we see happening around us, everything else starts to fall apart. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state and that you even learned something new. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.